You've seen us talk about this case in our ads. Today we're going to actually open it up and take a look at it as we prepare for a very overdue, longly an anticipated update to our how to water cool a computer guide. The last one we did was from like 2013. That J is a very different J. The Elite XG270QG from ViewSonic breaks the traditional ugly appearance of gaming monitors by providing an ultra-clean design while still delivering gamers the features that they want most. Features like a 1 millisecond response time, IPS 165Hz overclock display, black brushed aluminum stand with tilt and swivel, mouse and keyboard cable anchors, and customizable subtle lighting. To learn more about the XG270GQ from ViewSonic and to see current pricing, click the link in the description below. The Corsair 5000D. It's funny how the numbers just keep getting bigger and they all have the D. Moving on. This is the airflow version. And one of the things I like about Corsair is they still stay fairly true to the mid-tower form factor. Yes, there's the 1000D. You would think the 5000D would be 5 times bigger than the 1000D, right? No. The 1000D is the one that's like double wide and you can fit 2 systems in it and like 6,200 fans. But their mid-tower cases are fairly similar in the sense that a lot of them are based off of the same main steel structure, but they kind of change some of the internal stuff and then sort of the external layout to make them feel like different cases and not just another boring rectangle fractal. So I'm unboxing the white one here because, well, it's a lot easier to film than the black one. Right, Phil? You happy? Okay. One of the last builds I did using a Corsair case was using a case that wasn't new, but I still really liked, and that was a 570X Crystal. That's the one that had the glass top, glass sides, glass back, glass front. And it was a real PETA to cable manage because you can see everything. But the nice thing about the airflow case here is you have tempered glass panel on just one side. But as you can see, that is a thick manual for a case. I mean, look at the size of this manual. So in terms of the size of the book, that's the English manual. So the airflow version of the 5000D it's all the same structure as the non-airflow with the solid panel. It's just, as you can see, we've got ventilation here, a lot of open ventilation. Same thing on the top. You see we got some ventilation there with the same open gaps that you would expect. So all this vent, there's also a mesh up there to stop dust and stuff. There is a dust filter, but you've got nice gapped open sides, both on the front and the top, to give you the best amount of intake and exhaust possible. But one thing that's sort of new for the 5000D that doesn't exist on the 570X Crystal is the side vents right here. This is something that I think Lee sort of pioneered, and I think a lot of other brands are kind of starting to follow suit. But that is allowing for having rear-mounted radiators or fans along the motherboard tray. I've not personally used smoke to test what that does to the airflow. I tend to not really utilize that if I have an option of using front and top, because I would much rather have airflow come in the front of the case and make a nice swooping turn to the top, rather than having to come in and do like a 90 and a 90 or like a crazy turn, because the more air has to turn, the more turbulent it is, the less airflow there is. So that's the back panel right there. You can see the filter in there. And as you can see, the air filter does come out. The front side panel does have a plastic protection film on it, so that's why it's kind of cloudy right now. I do like that it has the white frosted sides. White cases, I like using them in videos because, like I've already said, for Phil, it makes them a lot easier to film rather than seeing just black shadowy mess everywhere. You do get 2 fans with this case, although they're kind of pitiful. They've got one 120 millimeter fan right here in the front, in the center, and one in the exhaust. What? Why can't they do this on the 570X Crystal? That way you have to close away all the wires and then have a glass panel here. We have what appears to be about 1 inch or maybe about 24 millimeters of depth between the back of the motherboard tray and this little door that closes. So you're clearly gonna have to be mindful of your cable management so that you are not causing yourself an issue of trying to close this door. Nothing sucks more, getting all your cables and everything in here and you're like, okay, let's close it up and play. And you're like, oh man, and then you can't close it. I've dealt with doors like this in other cases. It does probably lift up, yep, and comes off just like that. Now you can see starting on the back here, we have another cable tray. So this allows us to route some cables. And one of the things that we talked about in the ad as well is that it has internal cable management, which allows you to keep things as tidy as possible. So this would be perfect for running 8-pin EPS, maybe PCI Express, depending on the angle you want the wires to come down at. 3 SATA trays right here. They're 2.5-inch drive SATAs, or 2.5-inch accessories, because a lot of accessories now, like RGB controllers, fan controllers, other controllers, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head right now, will use the same mounting holes. So you got 3 options there. Looks like you do have some holes here on the backside of the motherboard tray, which might allow you to have something else to mount to there. This is got a nice giant opening as well. This comes off so that you can access the backside of the motherboard, so you can put in things like your AIO coolers and stuff without having to take the motherboard off to get to the back bracket. This appears to be some sort of a PSU shroud that goes somewhere. And then you do have another hard drive tray right here with 2 removable sleds that you can mount either, again, more controllers, 2 RGB controllers, 3.5-inch drives or 2.5-inch drives, and then have plenty of storage. Or you can remove it entirely, which we tend to do because I don't use 3.5-inch drives anymore, because SATA SSDs are cheap and have big capacity, and we use a lot of M.2 in what we do. Hey, they're right. All right, so you got a fan controller that's built in here. That's our SATA plug. This probably goes to, yes, right here. So you've got a PWM and RPM wire here. It looks like there's an RPM wire that plugs into your motherboard. You can actually control 6 fans on this case using 1 motherboard header. I would preferably use your CPU header or your CPU optional. If you are gonna be using something like the Commander Pro or any sort of the Corsair accessories, I would probably take this out entirely and then just have it look a little bit cleaner with less wires here. But the nice thing is you can control 6 fans, be 3 front, 3 top if I had my choice, and then take the rear fan if you're gonna run one and plug that into a chassis header on the motherboard. You can have all of them controlled off of 2 headers, which is kind of nice. It gets its supplemental power from the SATA plug here, so you don't have to worry about overloading your header with 6 fans. So I like seeing cases that come with built-in fan controllers, especially with how many fans you can run nowadays. You can run 10 fans in this one, right? 3 in the top, 3 in the front, 3 in the top, right? Yeah, 3 in the top, 3 in the front, 3 in the side, 1 in the rear. So 10 fans, they should have given you 2 of these. Now let's talk about this shroud right here. The nice thing about this is it's got this kind of a curved cover right here. So you could put 3 fans in here, or 2, or just 1 if you want. And what'll happen is it'll pull in air through this side vent we showed you over here on the side panel. And then it will actually curve that air and blow it across the motherboard. Now, that would be nice to use like some lower speed RPM fans on there. When fans are making, and the air has to make that crazy turn, the turbulence of the air hitting the shroud is what's gonna make the noise, not the actual fan or the blades itself. So I would actually run some high static pressure, low RPM fans. That way you could have some active airflow over your motherboard, which is something a lot of people forget when it comes to overclocking or building custom cooled systems, especially if you're running water cooled systems. Most of the time, unless you have an actively cooled VRM on your motherboard, the motherboard starts to get stifled of air because people run lower speed RPM fans on their radiators because they're like, hey, it's all nice and quiet and the CPU is nice and cool, and they forget about the other air-cooled components on the motherboard. So this shroud would actually direct the air over the motherboard, giving you active cooling to an otherwise forgotten piece of cooling when it comes to your system. So I like that. You can take the shroud off if you want and then just have it be a direct airflow with a rad or something there. I personally don't think that makes sense when you have room for the rads on the top and on the front. I would use that for a motherboard cooling shield or shroud, like I already said. All right, so we got a truck out there unloading, so I hope you guys hear that. Let's go and talk about the business side of the case, what you're gonna see. If you haven't noticed already, there are gray accents on this case. Gray on the front, even the IO covers are gray. The gray actually looks really good against the white. Even the little Corsair logo right here on the top is gray. So it looks pretty dope. Yeah, I said dope, it looks dope. I took off one of the shrouds on the back, which I want to point out, or the brackets for the drives. These are metal. So you can, if you've got some cool drives to show off, mount them on the front right here. If you had some cool RGB drives or something that you could, you know, I kind of wish this was gray to match. I guess technically you could spray paint this gray to match. Just remove the captive screw here, paint it to match, and then put it back in there, and then you could have drives that show off. Or leave them on the backside, because showing off your SSDs these days, especially if they're SATA drives, which is kind of, Oh, I expected it to be longer. I'm so used to the ones that are like the full length of the bottom. I was like, oh, this is gonna be a nice long power supply drive bracket filter. All right, so let's talk about motherboard fitment and size. This already has standoffs in here for ATX. EATX will fit in here as well. It's just you want to keep in mind, like we've talked about in the past, there's no standard these days for EATX. They just call anything wider than ATX EATX, and that could be a little bit wider or way wider, and there's EEATX, which is really, really wide and even longer. I'm only mentioning that because a standard ATX will fit in here, but because of this shroud, you need to keep a couple of things in mind. If your motherboard is making it all the way to the edge of the shroud, that looks super clean. Where your wire is gonna go. So you might have to take the shroud off, depending on the width of your motherboard, to be able to fit the wires through the grommets that are under here. So as you can see on the backside, there are grommets there. They're kind of hidden underneath the wire channel right here. But that goes right into the shroud. So that, in my opinion, is a little bit of a design flaw. You don't want it to be all like, that is your cable guide, okay? So keep that in mind. If it does interfere, you can remove the shroud. It'll just be a little bit uglier without it there. So that's something you want to keep in mind when it comes to the shroud and such. You do have openings in that shroud here for your fans to run through. Ironically, the pre-installed fan does not actually utilize any of those holes. It just kind of goes up and over. Most people are going to go ahead and probably customize this layout to their needs anyway. When it comes to taking off the back piece here, it literally, or the top piece, it literally just pops off with these little nubbins, which is kind of nice. That's thick metal, that's nice. And then you've got your air filter here, which has a little yellow rubber grabber. It is held on with magnets. If you're using it for an exhaust, I would recommend removing it entirely. And then you can see the amount of opening and adjustments you have to be able to mount a radiator there, slide it where you want. 140s and 120s will fit up there. You can see it's a pretty well thought out chassis. So when it comes to the front, I assume it's gonna come off in the same way. Absolutely, there it is. And then same thing here with the filter. You have access now to your fans. So the top piece is solid with the chassis. It doesn't come off to mount radiators and stuff, but the side piece here, it does, but it's kind of like, there we go. There's not much slack on that wire because it's already sort of in there. But as you can see, you can take the bracket out, mount your fans and your rad to it. The fans do need to go on the inside. There's not enough room on the outside to clear the chassis front pieces. There's not enough room to clear the chassis front pieces, so it does need to mount on the inside and then the radiator on it. So you're gonna have about 55 millimeters of thickness if you use a standard like 30 millimeter thick radiator, plus a 25 millimeter fan, which means this bottom shroud right here, whether or not this has to come off, because you can see there is an indentation right here to clear rads and fans. Whether this has to come off is going to depend on the thickness of the rad you go with. Now, one of the problems with removing these lower covers like this is if you go with a thicker radiator and fan setup, like I just said, you're going to hit this. Now, if you take this out like this is where this optional plate comes in. So you can slide this one in its place. So now a couple of things have happened here. One, you've created a nice cover that covers the end of the piece right here. One of the biggest complaints people had about the 570X Crystal was that it just had this open shroud and it looked really dumb like that. And two, this also allows an air scoop. So if you have all three fans right here and now you can fit a thick radiator or a reservoir or something here, the air is going to hit this and it's going to kind of make this sort of a transition up. I don't know how well it's going to scoop. It's fairly 90 degree. There is a little bit of a curve to it. But it's just a nicer looking piece right there. But that's the alternative, right? You can see the drive tray or whatever, which is just really ugly. I have a feeling I might end up using this one anyway, just because I kind of like the way that looks. The only downside of using this piece is it kind of exposes the bottom down here, which isn't the prettiest. So you have shroud options, which is kind of nice. I'm starting to get excited about doing a build in this case. So in terms of height clearances and stuff, this size chassis is gonna fit pretty much just about any air cooler and such on the market. So I'll give you some official figures here. Maximum GPU length is gonna be 370 millimeters. That's gonna obviously depend on how thick of a setup you go with in the front. If you go with fans and a radiator and then a reservoir or something mounted here, that's all gonna cut into the amount of length that you have available to it. So that 370 millimeters is gonna really depend on your front setup. Maximum CPU cooler height, 170 millimeters. Not the highest. That means some of your Noctua giant twin dual cooling tower setups may not clear the height of the side panel right here. So you need to keep in mind, air coolers need to be 170 millimeters or less. One thing people tend to not remember here is a lot of times on the top of the fin stack, you have a little bit of the tube or the heat pipe that sticks up where it's crimped, and that adds a few extra millimeters. So be diligent in checking your air coolers to make sure that that little bit of height, whether it be 2 to 5 millimeters, is accounted for. Trust me when I say I've had builds in the past before where that amount kept me from closing the side panel. And when it's glass, you can't modify it to make it close, so keep that in mind. Then the maximum PSU length says 180 millimeters. Once again, that's gonna be also dependent upon the lower hard drive bracket right here. That measurement's gonna be with the drive bracket in. If you take the bracket out, which I'm planning on doing, then you'll have a lot of room right here to put a big power supply, something like a 1600 watt if you want, if you're running like dual 3090s for like SLI overclocking for like Port Royal and stuff like that. It's a pretty well thought out case. It seems like Corsair is kind of just built upon what they've learned over the years in terms of how to keep a rectangle exciting. Because let's face it, I'm more into like the really weird, odd shapes and stuff when it comes to cases. But most people are just looking for a tower that can kind of give them flexibility, options, modularity to kind of set it up how they want. And they're maybe not interested in the crazy angles and stuff. So being able to have this much flexibility with radiator mounts in 3 different locations, airflow, obviously anything designed for good airflow is also gonna be great for radiators. They do have a more solid panel version, which is a little bit more for acoustics, being a little bit quieter. You do sacrifice airflow for that. That's the non-airflow edition, obviously. But we're gonna be doing a complete build in this. We're gonna be using this chassis, as well as a lot of Corsair water cooling stuff to show you guys how to water cool a computer here in 2021 and updating, like I said, my really old beginner's guide that I did going on, what, 8, 9 years ago. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and put a link to this product down in the description below. This was not a sponsored review or anything like that of the case. I just like to, this is something I always do. If I'm getting ready to do a build in something, I sort of tear it down, get an idea of what may go where to know, okay, I can fit this radiator, I can't fit that radiator, and then I'll start preparing for the build, rather than trying to figure it out as I go. Let's face it, a big amount of it's gonna be figured out as I go, but at least I get the big picture of what can and can't fit. So Corsair 5000D, this is the white edition. They also have black. Links to it are gonna be in the description below. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.